My Goodreads challenge goal for this year was to read 100 books, and I fell pitifully short of that. I did really well for the first 4 months, and then I hit a major reading slump that lasted like 6 months. And I only got back into reading this past October. So in total, I read about 40 books for the year, which is not a lot compared to some of the other book aficionados on here. But I really wanted to share my favorites anyway because I did have some transcendent reading experiences that I'm dying to talk about. If you're new to my channel, welcome. My name is Corey. This channel is all about reading and writing fiction. I recently posted a series documenting my NaNoWriMo journey, writing my first ever novel. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out here. Today, we are all about the books. So just to explain a little bit about my rating system, I don't give out 5 stars very often. Like the way I rate most books is I rate it 3 stars if I find it entertaining, but it was just fine. I give it 4 stars if I thought it was really, really good. That's like an A+ rating for me to give a book 4 stars. But 5 stars I reserve for those books that just give me that giddy, excited feeling while I'm reading it, where all I want to do is immerse myself in it and cry when it's over. Or if it's a book that really affected me in some way and I just can't stop thinking about it for days, weeks, or even months afterwards. So out of 40 books, only 6 of them got a 5-star rating. So I thought I would share with you what those books are and why I gave them 5 stars. Interestingly, my 6 5-star reads were an even split between fantasy and fiction. And yes, some authors are on this list more than once. And fair warning, not all of these books were actually released in 2023. They're just books that I read in 2023, but almost all of them were written within the last year or so. So hopefully that's relevant enough for you. And I don't have physical copies of all of them because the minimalist in me likes to mostly read on my Kindle, although I am starting to grow my physical book collection more recently. Okay, here we go. Coming in at number 6 was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. So this is the oldest book on this list. It was released, I think, in 2020, but it's historical fiction about 2 sisters during World War II in France. And I just thought it was so beautifully done. What I really loved about it was how different these sisters were in their personalities and their priorities, and how that influenced each of their approaches to getting through the war. So one of them was very much, a fiery activist who wanted to do whatever she could to push back against the Germans. And then the other one was a mother and a wife and just wanted to sort of keep her head down and keep her family safe. And there were consequences to both of these paths. And these paths were diverging in a way that it really affected their relationship as sisters. So I don't want to spoil anything, but I just thought it was so beautifully written, and I really loved all the themes that were talked about in this book as well. Number 5 was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I think I zipped through this book in about 2 days. It was just beautifully written. It's about these 2 friends, Sadie and Sam, who make video games together, and then these complications arise from their success. Like the tagline of the book says, it's not a romance, but it's about love. And I think that's just such a great way to put it. It's about the relationship between these 2 characters that never really become romantically involved with each other, but they're just so connected. And the main reason why I gave this book 5 stars is there's just one scene in it that just had me bawling. Like, that may not sound like a good thing, but I don't cry at books as much as I used to when I was younger, so it takes quite a bit to get me weepy. And that book does that so beautifully and so tragically. My 4th best read this year was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I read this in a single day. I just couldn't put it down. And I don't know what it is about R.F. Kuang. I have read 3 of her books now, and for each one of them, I would tell you it's not normally my kind of thing. But her writing is just so good that I just read everything she writes and love it anyway. And this book in particular, it was really uncomfortable to read because there's no real good people in this story. Everyone, especially the narrator, is just this awful kind of person, or at least she does really awful things. The book is about this writer in her 20s named June, and right at the start of the book, her frenemy and fellow author Athena dies right in front of her, and then June swipes the first draft of her next book and then passes it off as her own. And then basically the rest of the book is about her rise to fame and the increasing guilt and paranoia she feels as she tries to not get caught. But it's just so brilliantly written because of the way the author justifies her actions and her background, which kind of explains why she is the way she is. And Kwang writes June as this really unreliable narrator, which is just so much fun. And even though it's got this dark humor element to it, she tackles some really deep subjects like race and cancel culture and the dark side of the publishing industry. And it's just so brilliant. Like, I was sitting there shaking my head the whole time, being like, oh no. And I have to admit, it was a bit stressful reading it, but it was so good. So when I finished it, I instantly gave it 5 stars. And it's the kind of book that your mind just kind of keeps chewing on long after you finish reading it. Okay, book number 3 is another book by R.F. Kuang called Babel. This was published last year in 2022, and I read it all the way back in January of this year. But I still think about this book a lot, and its characters and its themes. In fact, I wrote an entire Medium article about this book, which I wasn't even reviewing books on that account before that point. That's how much this book affected me. So it's billed as a fantasy, but I would almost call it more of a historical fiction in an alternate universe with a strong helping of, I guess, magical realism. So it takes place in the 1830s and follows a Chinese boy called Robin Swift. And at the start of the book, his mother dies, and he gets taken in by this Oxford professor who trains him in language and translation with the expectation that he attends Oxford University when he's old enough. And to be honest, the book does start off a little bit slow. It's very dense. There's a lot of academia in it, to the point where you almost feel like you're sitting in a university lecture at times learning about language and translation. But it evolves into this unbelievably heartbreaking story that, again, tackles these heavy themes around race and colonialism, sexism, rebellion, ethics, betrayal, and death. And what really made it stay with me is how human and morally gray the characters are. As I've noticed, that's how this author really likes to write her characters. And the relationship that develops between the characters are so textured and so gripping, and the ending is jaw-droppingly good. So literally for 11 months out of the past 12 months, Babel was at the top of my list for best reads, and I really didn't think anything was going to dethrone it. Yellowface was the only one that came close, but then I came across these next 2 books, which I adored so much. So coming in at number 2 was Tress of the Emerald Sea. So prior to this book, I hadn't really read much Brandon Sanderson. 3 years ago, I attempted to read Warbreaker, but I DNF'd it around 36% of the way through. And I'm not sure why. I think it was just such a long book, and I wasn't quite ready for that level of world building and fantasy. And I think I will try reading it again now that I've sort of built up my fantasy reading chops. But anyway, all I ever saw on Book Talk for this entire past year was how amazing Tress of the Emerald Sea was. And it kept getting mentioned over and over again. And I really liked that it was a standalone, and people said it was a bit easier to digest than some of his high fantasy stuff. So I gave it a shot, and I absolutely adored it. It's about a young woman named Tress who lives on a rock and has no plans to ever leave it. But then her love gets taken captive in a treacherous sea of spores, and she has to go save him. And she just goes on this really entertaining adventure. And I absolutely love Sanderson's writing style and the narrator, which is this character named Hoyd. I kind of want everything I read from now until the end of time to be narrated by Hoyd. He's this character who shows up in a lot of Sanderson's books that takes place in the Cosmere universe. But I don't really know much more about that character outside of these secret project books that were just released this past year. But I absolutely love the way the character describes things, and he goes off on these little tangents, and it's just so witty and clever and brilliant. And now for book number 1, which is, believe it or not, another Brandon Sanderson book, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. This instantly became my favorite book of the year. I loved it so much that I might make an entire video about my thoughts on this book. We'll see. So this is another of Sanderson's secret project books that was released this past July, and it's about these 2 young adults from completely separate worlds. One of them goes by the name of Painter, and he lives in this kind of night-shrouded city that's reminiscent of modern Japan. And the other is Yumi, who holds a highly esteemed role known as a yokihijo. She lives in this swelteringly hot environment where the ground is hot enough to burn your feet and the foliage floats in the air. And let's just say both of these characters have really interesting jobs and situations. And randomly, seemingly randomly, they suddenly find themselves swapping places with each other. even though they're strangers and they have no idea what's going on. And the story is about them figuring out why this is happening and what they need to do. This is also narrated by Hoyd, just like Trust of the Emerald Sea. It's very funny, it's descriptive, it's just really beautifully written. Like, I never felt the need to annotate books before I read this, but now I kind of want to start annotating my books. In fact, I loved both of these books so much that I went to the Brandon Sanderson website and I ordered these premium edition copies. Like, the minimalist in me is screaming because I now have 2 hard copies of the same book, not to mention that between the exchange rate and the shipping cost to Canada is kind of expensive. But I just love them so much, and they come with these beautiful images inside, and I just absolutely no regrets, 100% worth it. Just absolutely beautiful. So those were my top picks, and I think the moral of the story is that I'm now obsessed with fantasy books. But I would love to know what your favorite reads were this year and what's on your TBR for 2024. I'm always looking for more book recs, so drop them in the comments below. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful and safe holiday season, and I'll see you next year.